persecuted by the idolatrous Meccans for the religious revolution he was inciting, Mohammed was forced to flee to Yathrib, which he later renamed Medina. Legend states that the first miracle occurred during this flight. A spider spun a web at the entrance to Muhammad's hiding place in order to deceive his pursuers. The Arabian prophet was born in Mecca in 570 AD. At 40, he had a revelation. Located 350 kilometers from Mecca, Yathrib was an important stop for the great caravans heading to Persia, yet it had never developed into a major metropolis. It had, thus far, been relegated to the margins of history due to its peculiar location and mixed population. This changed in 622 with the Hijra, the migration that initiated the Islamic era. Muhammad was received triumphantly by the common people of Medina, especially the daughters of his mother's clan, who chanted a still famous song. Everyone wanted Muhammad to honor their home with his presence. Afraid of generating jealousies, or perhaps recalling the 1001 rivalries that divided the city, he let his camel decide. Wherever it stopped would be the Prophet's new home.
Yathrib's strategic situation is key to understanding the Hijra. Yathrib was the most important oasis in all the Hijaz because of its agricultural prosperity and the size of its population.
Yathrib was home to several groups, including the Jewish tribes, the Kainuka, the Nadir, and the Qurayza. There were also pagan Arabic tribes, such as the Aus and the Khazraj, who weren't even natives of the city, but had arrived there from Yemen. Feuding broke out between the Aus and the Khazraj, causing rifts within the city of Yathrib.
It was an unstable and explosive situation that had the potential to provoke another civil war. It was in complete contrast to the situation in Mecca, where the Quraysh had triumphed by forging alliances.
At this point in time, the Quraysh know they have nothing to fear from Yathrib. The city is self-destructing. There's no danger of it claiming its share of trade or wealth, despite its strategic location along the caravan route.
This is when the pilgrims from Yathrib decide to suggest to their fellow citizens that this holy man, who spoke such beautiful and stirring words, be invited to their city to serve as mediator of their quarrels.
يا رفيع الشأن والدرج يا رسول الله سلام عليك يا رفيع الشأن والدرج مولاي صل وسلم دائما أبدا على النبي وآل البيت كلهم يا ربي بالمصطفى بلغ مقاصدنا
After erecting the first mosque of Islam, and with most of the Quran already revealed, Muhammad added to his stature as prophet and messenger of God, fully exercising his role as political arbitrator of Yathrib. Yet, as a recent widower, he felt a permeating solitude.
إحدى المؤمنات جاءت تخرج النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم من حالة الحزن التي يعيشها. جاءت إلى النبي وقالت: يا رسول الله ألا أتزوج؟ قال: ومن أتزوج؟ فتقول: أحب خلق الله إليك.
بنت أحب خلق الله إليك.
ووردت أيضا أحب خلق الله إليك عن عائشة. نعم. ففي شيء يبدو أن السيدة عائشة من طفولتها ظهر فيها علامات النجابة والنبوغ والذكاء. كان شيء هناك محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم منجذب إليها. كانت طفلة صغيرة السيدة عائشة، ولكن منذ هذه الطفولة كان هناك توجه عاطفي من قبل النبي لها، كان يحبها، ولا شك أن لها ميزات ممتازة جعلت النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يميزها ويؤثرها. نحن في عصرنا قد نستهجن هذه الفوارق في العمر وفي السن، لكن يبدو بهذاك العصر ما كان له قيمة أبدا موضوع السن والعمر. المهم أننا نرى الزواج ناجح يمشي بنجاح، والسيدة عائشة كانت إلى أقصى حد محبة ومتفاعلة مع النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم، لم تشعر بأي ظلم أنه هو أكبر منها بكثير. حصلت الخطبة ولم تتزوج إلا بعد الهجرة بسنة أو سنتين تقريبا.
The Muslims were divided into two groups: the Muhajirun, made up of those that had emigrated to Medina from Mecca, and the Ansar, a name given by the Prophet to those in Medina who had supported him. He abolished the names Aus and Khazraj, which were reminiscent of the conflicts that divided them, and the two communities were united.
He created a unified group whose members were not bound by blood, as in a tribe, nor by ethnic ties. The only thing that distinguishes one Arab from another is his devotion. He established this group, which he called the Ummah, meaning nation or community, and he based it on a confessional principle, on a brotherhood of faith.
Each Muslim became the brother of all other Muslims. This means that he extended the community beyond tribal boundaries and established a society of believers. Faith is what united the individual members of these different tribes.
لما هاجر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم عن المدينة فهناك أعمال قام فيها. أول أعمال اللي قام فيها هي تأسيس الدولة الإسلامية. كيف أسس الدولة الإسلامية؟ من خلال بناء المسجد اللي يعتبره هو ركيز للدولة الإسلامية. فيه بيجتمع المسلمين بيتداول أمورهم الحربية والسياسية والدينية كل الأمور فيه. ثاني عمل عمله النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لدى وصوله للمدينة هو المؤاخاة بين المهاجرين والأنصار. أصبح الأنصاري يتنازل عن كل ما يملك نصف ما يملك لأخوه المهاجر من ديار وأموال، حتى أنه تنازل عنه عن بعض زوجاته. ثالث عمل هو أوجد النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم دستور يحكم بين المسلمين. هالدستور ضمن انه اليهود بيتعاملوا مثل معاملة الاسلام، مثل معاملة المسلمين، لهم مثل ما علينا وعليهم مثل ما علينا، وكل اهل الكتاب.
He established something called the Charter of Medina. In modern terms, this was the first constitution in Muslim society, and in it, the Prophet acknowledged religious plurality.
In terms of religious practices, each religious community was responsible for managing its own affairs.
The Quran insists on freedom of belief. One of the verses says, "There is no compulsion in religion." This statement is clear and unequivocal. You have the freedom to choose to believe or not to believe.
So he had the different groups sign a treaty requiring all of them to show mutual respect and to live in harmony in accordance with the laws and their social obligations.
In other words, the Jews in Medina, along with the Muslims and Christians, were called upon to defend Medina even if they shared religious or ethnic ties with their attackers. This is similar to the idea of a social or national contract.
في المدينة تنزل الأمطار أكثر مما هو الحال في مكة، فإذا ببعض أصحابه يصابون بحمى المدينة، ومن شدة حماها كان الذين أصيبوا بالحمى من شدة الحرارة يهذون يتكلمون فلا يعون الكلام، وليس ذلك بغريب، فالمهاجرون من مكة غادروا بيئة عاشوا بها واعتادوها إلى بيئة مختلفة، حتى أن كثيرا من المسلمين ما عادوا يقدرون على الصلاة وقوفا فكانوا يصلون قعودا. توجه رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم بالدعاء لربه فقال: اللهم حبب إلينا المدينة كما حببت إلينا مكة أو أشد، وبارك لنا في مدها وصاعها، وانقل وباءها إلى الجحفة، والجحفة مجمع الأسيال حيث تنتهي إليها المياه القذرة وما شابه. سنرى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم وهو رسول الله لا يكتفي بالدعاء، عمل على إكراء الأنهار والوديان، أي تطهيرها وتنظيفها ومنع استنقاع الماء فيها، وحفر الآبار ليستخرج الماء العذب للشرب. رسول الله حرم إلقاء القاذورات أو الأوساخ أو التبول في حواري المدينة، فلم يمض على المدينة شهور عديدة حتى صار الذباب الذي يرتع في حواريها وفي بيوتها صار بعيدا، والبعوض صار بعيدا، وصارت المدينة نقية طاهرة عذبة لمن أراد فيها الحياة.
In Medina, revelations came to Muhammad in a completely different style and rhythm. Verses were much longer and became increasingly legislative and prescriptive. The rules concerning incest, the marriage code, food, and inheritance were all revealed at Medina. The rituals were not outlined in exhaustive detail, apart from the one about pilgrimage. For prayer, paradoxically, only the stipulations for practicing in cleanliness were elaborated in detail in the Word of God.
O believers, when you prepare to pray, wash your face and your hands up to your elbows. Wipe your head and your feet up to your ankles. Purify yourselves after cohabiting with your wives. But if you are sick or traveling, when you have satisfied your natural needs, or when you have done business with a woman, in cases when you cannot find water, rub your face and hands with fine, pure sand. Surah 5, verses 8 and 9.
The Prophet's control over Yathrib was put to the test for the first time in 624 AD, the second year of the Hijrah. The Meccans had begun to fear the Prophet's newfound power over the city.
Historians claim that Mecca produced nectar, while Yathrib produced war. Mecca was home to love, while Medina was home to war.
This policy of confrontation was motivated by urgent material needs. What were the emigrants to eat? While there were some merchants among them, they had lost all their money. Others, even poorer, were neither craftsmen nor farmers. How would they provide for themselves? They came up with the most logical solution. They would live according to the age-old Arab practice of jihad. It was then that Muhammad decided to launch attacks against the Quraysh.
He took their penchant for raiding each other and he channeled it toward the enemies of the emerging religion. Muhammad's successors would also exploit this Bedouin ferocity in their conquests.
Islam preached that prosperity would come later, on the final judgment day, in paradise. But in Yathrib, the Prophet legalized raiding and authorized abductions and attacks against Quraysh caravans wherever they were found.
He wanted to impose an economic blockade on the Meccans by attacking their caravans headed for Syria on their way past Yathrib.
The Muslims decided to wage an economic war against the Quraysh. There was a very large trade caravan led by the Quraysh commander, Abu Sufyan. Almost all Meccans, no matter what their means, took part in it to some degree.
Badr. No chronicle would ever have mentioned this remote corner of the world if not for its 3 wells and if as a result it hadn't been an obligatory stop on the caravan route. Since Muhammad's move, migrants kept arriving from Mecca. They were idle with no resources, and this increasingly irritated the Medinites. Was it by chance that the Prophet decided to launch the military operation of Badr right at this moment?
وخرجوا إلى المدينة المنورة تركوا وراءهم ديارهم وأموالهم وأخذها المشركون غنيمة. وحينما علم النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بخبر قافلة لقريش خرج من بلاد الشام وعلى رأسها أبو سفيان بن حرب تريد مكة المكرمة استنفر أصحابه للخروج إلى هذه القافلة. لا يريدون القتال، إنما يريدون تعويض ما فقدوه من أموالهم. وجاءت قريش زاحفة تريد القتال، وكان عددهم ما بين 900 إلى 1000 مقاتل، وكان عدد الصحابة 300 ونيف من المقاتلين. خرجوا لا يريدون القتال، وجاء أولئك يريدون أن يطفئوا نور الله بأفواههم، وابتدأ القتال. ووقف النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم في العريش، المكان الذي صنعه له أصحابه ليشرف على قيادة المعركة، وراح يتضرع إلى الله وهو يبكي ويقول: اللهم هذه قريش أتت بخيلائها تريد أن تطفئ نورك، اللهم نصرك الذي وعدت لأوليائك، اللهم إن تهلك هذه العصبة فإنك لن تعبد في الأرض بعدها أبدا. وما زال رسول الله يدعو إلى أن خفق في العريش خفقة وقال: أبشر يا أبا بكر، هذا جبريل آخذ بعنان فرسه يقوده على النقع. فكانت الملائكة تقاتل إلى جانب المؤمنين صفا بصف ويدا بيد، وكان النصر للمسلمين، وخذل الله المشركين وأسر من المشركين 70 مقاتلا.
With the Muslim victory, the face of the world changed. The Muslims won. This marked the beginning of the spread of Islam. Had the infidels won, it would have spelled the end of Islam.
Up to that point, the words of the Prophet and the Quran had always deferred the promise of wealth. But as of that moment, Material gain here on earth was promised as a reward for embracing Islam. If we win, I get money. I can capture women. I can become rich, even if I was poor before.
We can say that statehood and a military began to emerge after the Battle of Badr.
From the moment all of this was authorized, more and more people began to convert to Islam. As a result, after only 10 years in Yathrib, Mohammed was able to lay siege to Mecca with a force of 10,000 soldiers.
نون والقلم وما يسطرون ما أنت بنعمة ربك بمجنون يلا على السطر اللي بعده
A new factor, the spoils of war, then upset the deal. The 8th surah of the Quran, a long one about the consequences of the Battle of Badr, was revealed, regulating spoils like a veritable institution. First was the innovation concerning captives. Muhammad decreed an original rule that each prisoner would teach 10 Muslims to write and then be released. With Badr, migrants loyal to the Prophet could finally raise their head. The bothersome, unproductive intruders were now fighters and property owners. The people of Medina, whom the Prophet named Ansar, those who came to him as reinforcement, confronted the Meccan devils, and the Ansar, neglected by history, won, no doubt thanks to God.
The Quraysh tribe was weakened and began to vacillate. There was still one problem in Yathrib: the Jews.
Jewish scholars may not have been fonts of knowledge, but they certainly knew the Bible much better than Muhammad did. This was probably one of the main reasons for their rupture.
On the strength of their own revelation, the Jews were the living denial of Mohammed's prophecy. There they were, using their own sacred book to deny the mission of Mohammed to his face and in his very own city.
This was a decisive factor that led Muhammad to break with the Jews. He felt insulted and would prove to be merciless in his treatment of them.
It was necessary to get rid of this disruptive element in Yathrib, so that all that remained in the city would be this unified group who believed in Islam.
On his arrival in Medina, the Prophet preached only against idol worship. He allowed the Jews to preserve their faith. He forged a pact with them.
This pact, which was established in writing, was short-lived because the Meccans, who had been defeated at Badr, had secretly renewed contact with the Jews in Medina. 2 years after Badr, they attacked Medina at Uhud, and during this battle they defeated the Prophet.
Muhammad's break with the Jews happened gradually. After the victory at Badr, he confronted one of the tribes over a minor incident. In the end, they arrived at an agreement, and the Jews left. Although this was a small victory for Muhammad, it did allow him to put one of the tribes out of commission.
misfortune is good for something. This is more or less how the early chronicles of Islam extolled the defeat at Uhud. While the triumph at Badr had strengthened the faithful, it lulled them into forgetting about forming a real army. Seeking revenge for Badr, the Meccans led several thousand men to Uhud, close to Medina. The Prophet's army overestimated its strength and was defeated, even though it had enlisted mercenaries commanded by heroes from the earlier Meccan campaign, such as Omar and Hamza, Muhammad's young uncle. Hamza fell in this battle, killed by a slave with no other stake in the whole thing than buying his freedom.
After the defeat at Uhud, Mohammed set out to neutralize the second Jewish tribe, the Nadir, again on a minor pretext. A ransom had to be paid, and Mohammed appealed to the Nadir chief for a contribution. Given that the Jews now belonged to the Ummah, the new social structure established by Mohammed at Yathrib.
The Jews, the Nadir leaders, replied, Abu al-Qasim, we grant you the aid you request. So they agreed to pay, to help out.
Mohammed was sitting with his closest advisors when suddenly he got up and left. The others followed, asking, "Where are you going?"
He replied, I have received a visit from my brother Gabriel. He has informed me they are plotting against me.
And then he said, I have learned that the Jews are planning my death. So he declared war and surrounded them, and history repeated itself. The Jews were counting on their allies, who did nothing, and they were forced to surrender.
After defeating them, he gave them a choice between submitting to his authority or being expelled. They chose to leave Medina and emigrate. Some emigrated to Khaybar, while others went to Syria, Palestine, and Iraq.
The Jews surrendered. But unlike the last time, they weren't given the opportunity to sell their possessions. He let them leave with only their personal effects. They were forced to abandon their land. In one fell swoop, he had rid himself of the Nadir and secured a homeland for the emigrants.
One day, the Prophet needed to correspond with a prominent figure and went to see his freed slave, Zayd, now his adopted son. Mohammed found only Zayd's wife, Zainab, who received him. The Messenger of God had previously felt an aversion to this woman, but seeing her this time, he was seduced. He said, "Oh, how the transcendence of God inverses the heart's inclinations." He declined Zainab's proposal to stay and wait for Zayd, and he left. When her husband returned, Zainab told him about the words of the Messenger of God. Zayd was edified by this, and God triggered antipathy in his heart for his spouse, so that he turned away from her. Zayd went to see the Prophet and said, "O Messenger of God, I wish to separate from my wife. She's too noble for me, and this is hurtful to me." "Keep your wife and fear God," recommended the Prophet. Nevertheless, Zayd ended up divorcing her. Zainab, the daughter of a noble tribe, was very generous with the most disenfranchised. She even worked to distribute aid to the destitute. Aisha said that Zainab was the most beautiful and desirable of her whole entourage. Although Zainab was much older than Aisha, in her 40s by this time, they shared a great complicity. Months later, in a state of divine inspiration, God scolded his prophet to go and confront his desire. And the order was given to accept marriage to Zainab. Thus the prophet summoned Zayd and said to him, I trust no one more than you. Go in my name and ask for the hand of Zainab. At Zainab's house, Zayd found her kneading bread and broke the news to her. The joyful Zainab said grace to God in a prayer. Zamakshari, 12th century.
C'est à cette occasion que Aïcha, son autre épouse, lui a raconté.
On this occasion, Aisha, one of his other wives, said to him jokingly, Your God's revelations are much to your benefit.
Tous ces mariages de Mohammed,
all of Muhammad's marriages, according to the historians, were political. The Zainab episode was different in that Muhammad's desire broke the law. It's interesting to observe the Prophet, this man assuming his transgression, assuming his desire through transgression. And in this episode, we see the emergence, through this desire, of an absolute, a kind of transcendence. In Surah 33, the factions, the revelation is ambiguous. The first verses state that Muhammad is the father of none among your men, and that the Quran rules over the prohibition of adoption and the naming of children. The latter blurs lineage and the logic of inheritance. This surah also concerns married couples and the dress code for women.
In the early days of Islam, the veil was not enforced as strictly as it is today. The veil was a woman's right. She was free to decide on her own when and where she wore it.
The surah of the veil, hijab, came down on the day of his marriage to Zainab.
A companion of the Prophet's wives had gone out during the night to relieve herself. Some men approached her and molested her, and the Prophet began to worry.
It was after this incident that the Prophet received the verse that led him to veil his wives, that is, to forbid them from fraternizing with other men.
Let's talk about mixed worship. There are thousands of mosques in the Muslim world, but we have only inherited one mosque that remains exactly as it was in the Prophet's time. That is the Kaaba Mosque. This is the only mosque where mixed worship is permitted. Women circle the Kaaba alongside men. They cast stones with the men for the act of lapidation or stoning. They jostle to touch the black stone with men at their sides. Mixed worship does exist, and that's how it was in the mosques during the Prophet's time.
Women attended the councils that were held in the Prophet's presence. They came of their own accord, unveiled and without discrimination, to consult with the Prophet on many topics. The conversations were direct. They spoke to each other directly.
My point is that if we want to interpret the situation of women, we have to interpret it as it was during the Prophet's lifetime. What happened during the decadent period when they segregated women and hid them away in the palace harems is a far cry from the tolerance that dominated during the Prophet's era. The relationship between men and women at the time was one of great tolerance.
So there are some obscurantist elements that affected Muslims, not Islam, but that were attributed to Islam, even though they had nothing to do with the religion.
وقد امتلأ قوة وحيوية فقال يا رسول الله ائذن لي في الزنا نظر إليه النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام وقال له أقبل، فأقبل هذا الشاب، فقال له النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام أترضاه لأمك؟ أي أترضى هذه الفعلة لأمك؟ قال لا، فداك أبي وأمي يا رسول الله. قال له النبي وكذلك الناس لا يرضونها لأمهاتهم. أترضاه لأختك؟ قال لا، فداك أبي وأمي يا رسول الله. قال وكذلك الناس لا يرضونه لأخواتهم. أترضاه لخالتك؟ وراح يعدد عليه قريباته، وفي كل مرة كان يقول لا، فداك أبي وأمي يا رسول الله، والنبي يقول له وكذلك الناس لا يرضونه لأخواتهم ولا لخالاتهم ولا لعماتهم. ثم قال له أدنوا أيضا، فدنا هذا الشاب الممتلئ، فوضع النبي عليه الصلاة والسلام يده على صدره وقال اللهم طهر قلبه وحصن فرجه واغفر ذنبه. فقال هذا الرجل بعد إذ كان هذا الدعاء، قال والله أتيت إلى رسول الله وما من شيء أحب إلى قلبي من الزنا، وخرجت من عند رسول الله وما من شيء أبغض إلى قلبي من الزنا.
That old demon, insurrection, reawoke in Medina. A faction which the Quran referred to as the hypocrites joined with Muhammad's enemies and got together to plot the siege of the prophetic capital.
The Prophet, forewarned that all the infidels were coming together to attack him, gathered his companions to deliberate with them. They all thought they should lock themselves inside the city. Salman the Persian said, "At home in Persia, when a large army comes to attack a city where the army is not fit to meet the enemy, we dig a moat around the city to stop the cavalry from coming in." The Prophet and all his companions approved Salman's counsel. In a month, the moat was finished. When the infidels saw the moat around Medina, they were struck with amazement. They had never seen one before. Unable to get over it, they came daily to the gates of the city. The infidels stayed there 26 days without a fight. Naim, a prominent figure among the attackers, to whom God had granted the inclination towards Islam, arose during the night, left his tent, presented himself to the Prophet, professed his faith and said, "Apostle of God, I have long been a secret believer. Give me your instructions now." The Prophet told him, "I want you to go back to the infidels and try to divide them."
He coined the phrase, still used today, "War is a game of cunning." He sent agents among them to stir up trouble. They killed each other, and on top of it all, it was winter. There was heavy rain, and the siege thus ended without combat.
At nightfall, God unleashed a wind over the infidels' camp that overturned their tents. The enemy was filled with terror because a violent storm threatened overhead. Abu Sufyan decided to flee. The infidels left that very night, emptying their bags of everything that weighed them down. During the siege, the Muslims suspected the Jews of Medina, the Qurayza, of making secret contact with the besiegers at night. But a ruse by Naim, the spy, prevented their access to Medina on the side he was defending. With the Meccans gone, the last Medina Jews knew they were done for. The angel Gabriel came to tell the Prophet, "God orders you not to lay down arms before finishing with the Qurayza." After a siege of 25 days, the Jews, down to their last recourse, finally requested surrender.
What could be done with this Jewish tribe? Here we come across a new incident that reveals Muhammad's pragmatism. He would not be the one to decide the fate of this Jewish tribe. Rather, he appointed an arbitrator to rule in his place.
He said, "Saad, decide their fate." Saad said, "Kill the men capture the children, and seize the belongings. The Prophet said to him, "You have judged them with the judgment of Allah above the 7 heavens."
And so he issued a terrible decree. The women and children were to be sold as slaves, and all the men executed. A pit was dug, and the Qurayza approached one by one like little lambs to have their heads cut off.
As with any new and emerging state, even the smallest retreat, the slightest hesitation could prove fatal. This is why it was often necessary to sacrifice large numbers of people in order to reinforce the power of the new state. The lesson was a terrifying one for the entire population of the Arab Peninsula. Everybody was terrified at the news of the execution of 900 people in a single day.
This is the most dramatic episode. It was later used as propaganda by the Byzantine Christians, who accused Muhammad of being an impostor, a cruel man who had used force to impose himself.
Mecca was shaken to learn this, for if the Prophet were to invade Mecca with his soldiers, they would kill them as they had the Qurayza. Other Arabs were petrified. All those who were still opposed or undecided were absolutely terrified.
The process initiated with the Jews' refusal to recognize the prophetic nature of Muhammad's message ended in definitive rupture. In Muslim tradition, this separation is represented by the direct allegiance of Islam to Abraham, the source of all monotheisms, through his son Ishmael.
كان ليش معك أبوك بيحكي معه شايف هذا فدو إسماعيل رب العالمين أبونا إبراهيم الخليل شاتي منهم إني بيذبحوا لأبونا إسماعيل فقوم رب العالمين يقول له يا أبتي افعل ما تؤمر تجدني إن شاء الله من الصابرين. فلما جاب عمشه وجاب السكينة بده يذبحه، السكينة تنقلب على عفاها بإذن رب العالمين. فرب العالمين بعته من السماء كبش فدول إسماعيل. قال له هذا أبونا عواد إسماعيل هذا فدو. وعاد فكل له عماش وجابوا الخروف ذبحوا عواد سيدنا إسماعيل. تذبح الخروف أنت تذبح الخروف؟ أيوه. أنا بجيب الذبح. تذبح الخروف. فهمت قصته يا أبي؟ مع السلامة. الله يعطيك سلمنا على أبوك. مع السلامة خيو مع السلامة.
When he imposed prayer on the Muslims, Muhammad thought it was normal to pray in the direction of Jerusalem, as did the Jews and Christians. But what happened in reality is that they didn't acknowledge him as a prophet. The Jews fought him, and the Christians turned their backs on him.
Entonces es cuando Mahoma insiste o encuentra la solución o la revelación le da esa solución.
Muhammad finally came up with this solution, unless it came to him in a revelation, the Abramization of his message. This means that it was the same revelation, but he went to the source itself of this revelation, Abraham. This revelation is not Jewish, because the origin of Judaism is Moses and his law. He bypasses the Christians and the Jews, of course, and goes directly to the source of monotheism itself.
It is a fundamental understanding of Islamic thought that what non-Muslims see as the last of the major monotheistic religions, that is, Islam, is in fact the primordial monotheistic religion. In fact, there's a famous hadith or saying of the Prophet to this effect, that all children are born Muslim and that it is the parents who make them Jews or Christians. So Islam sees itself as being the original expression of God's will.
He said, "Why should we continue to look upon Jerusalem as our Qibla, the direction of prayer? All we have to do is return to our original Abrahamic Qibla, which is the Kaaba. Since his ancestor by Ishmael was Abraham, and since he was also his religious ancestor, his spiritual guide, as he was for the other monotheistic religions."
A second major consequence of the rupture with the Jews and Christians is what we might call the Arabization of the message. In short, let's say Abramization on the one hand, and an appeal to the source of revelation on the other.
So when Muslims see differences between the Bible and the Quran, or between the beliefs of Jews and Christians and those of their own, they attribute this difference to Jewish and Christian corruption, either deliberate or inadvertent, of their scriptures and of the revelation that they received from God.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. جلس النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قبل بعثته وبعد بعثته يتعبد الله ويتحنس الليالي ذوات العدد، وذلك على الحنيفية السمحاء التي كان عليها الأنبياء من قبله. وبعد بعثته يتجه إلى بيت المقدس أولى القبلتين، لكن رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يتطلع إلى السماء ما بين الفينة والأخرى، ينتظر أمرا من الله بأن يجعل للمسلمين وجهة تختلف عن وجهة من قبله. جلس 16 شهرا صلى الله عليه وسلم مع أصحابه بعد هجرته إلى المدينة المنورة يتوجه إلى بيت المقدس، وبينما هو في صلاته يصلي بالمسلمين وإذا به صلى الله عليه وسلم ينزل عليه الوحي ويأمره بأن يتوجه إلى الكعبة المشرفة لتكون قبلة للمسلمين إلى يوم القيامة. ونزل قوله تعالى: قد نرى تقلب وجهك في السماء فلنولينك قبلة ترضاها فول وجهك شطر المسجد الحرام وحيث ما كنتم فولوا وجوهكم شطره. واتجه المسلمون بصلاتهم إلى الكعبة المشرفة لتكون قبلة لهم وإلى قيام الساعة.
We shall see how, in Medina, Muhammad commanded 2 intense battles, putting as much skill into building a city, a public space, and peace between believers, as into waging the so-called war against the Bedouin spirit. Muhammad would end his life in Medina.